All right, so we're still working with radicals, so we're going to rationalize binomial denominators. So what this means is we actually have two terms on the denominator, and the reason that we have two terms is because they're going to be separated either by a minus sign, like there are sections 1 and 2, or by a plus sign. So that makes this having two terms, which means binomial. Okay, so you can see they're all separated like that. Okay, so in order for us to cancel out the square root that is on the bottom, we are going to have to multiply by what we call the conjugate, sorry. So in here, we're going to do -2, and then instead of minus, we're going to do plus the square root of 7. And so that's how we are going to cancel out the square root on the bottom. Now remember, whatever we do on the bottom, we have to do on the top. Okay? And so we're going to go ahead and distribute this -8 to each one when we multiply. So -8 times -2 is a positive 16. And a -8 times a positive square root of 7 is going to give us the -8 and the square root of 7. Okay. And then on the denominator, so we're going to go ahead and also distribute. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and multiply the first ones. -2 times -2 is going to give us positive 4. And then -2 times the square root of 7 is going to give us -2 and the square root of 7. Okay. Now we also have to multiply the negative square root of 7 times -2. So a negative and a negative make a positive. So that's going to be a positive 2 and the square root of 7. And then we take the negative square root of 7 and multiply it times a positive square root of 7. So a negative times a positive is going to give us a negative. And the square root of 7 times the square root of 7 is just 7. Okay. So then here, if you notice, these two, when we combine them, they cancel each other out. -2 in the square root of 7 and +2 in the square root of 7, they cancel each other out. Okay. So we're left with on the top 16 minus 8 and the square root of 7. And then on the denominator, we're left with this 4 minus 7. Okay, well, 4 minus 7 is -3. Okay. Now, if you can take the 16 and divide it by -3 and simplify it, or the -8 and divide it by -3 and simplify it, go ahead and do that. But this does not simplify, so we'll just leave it like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and try another one. Okay, so here we multiply what we call is the conjugate by the conjugate. So we do -4, and the square root of 8 stays the same. But instead of having the minus sign in between, we're going to have a plus sign in between. That's what's going to make the square root cancel. Okay. Now, if we multiply the bottom by the conjugate, we also have to multiply the top by the conjugate. And so now we are going to multiply 6 times -4. That gives us -24. And we also have to multiply the 6 by the 8. So it'll be plus 6 and the square root of 8. Okay, so then from there, we are going to, let's see, what can we do? Oh, we need to multiply the bottom ones. Okay, so then we're going to go ahead and take the -4 and multiply it times this -4, and that gives me positive 16. I take the -4 and I multiply it times the positive square root of 8, and that's going to give me a negative and a positive, give me a -4 and the square root of 8. Then we go ahead and multiply the negative square root of 8 times the -4, and that gives me a positive 4 and the square root of 8. And then I'm going to take the negative square root of 8 and multiply it times the positive square root of 8, and that gives me -8. Okay, because the square roots end up canceling out. So then let's go ahead and continue. The top part stays the same, -24 plus 6 in the square root of 8, and then the bottom part, we're going to simplify it. The -4 in the square root of 8 and the positive 4 in the square root of 8, those cancel each other out because one's negative and one's positive. Okay. Then all we have left is 16 minus 8, and that gives me 8. Okay. Remember, we can simplify the square root of 8. Just in case you guys don't remember, the square root of 8 is the same thing as 4 times 2. And you can take the square root of 4. That gives us 2. Okay, so if I were to take the square root of 4, that's going to give me 6 times 2, which is 12. And then this 2 right here stays trapped in the square root. Okay, this is going to be over 8. And then we're going to distribute the -24. And the 8, we can actually divide those and get a whole number. 24 divided by 8 gives me 3. So negative 3 plus 12 divided by 8. It doesn't simplify as a whole number, but as a fraction, this would give me 3 over 2 and the square root of 2. And that's it. Okay, so let's try another one. This one we have 5 over the negative square root of 6 plus the square root of 6. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and multiply by the conjugate. Okay, negative 6 minus the square root of 6, and on the top, we multiply by the exact same thing. So then we're going to go ahead and distribute. 5 times negative 6 is negative 30. 5 times negative square root of 6 is going to be minus 5 and the square root of 6. On the denominator, we first start off by multiplying negative 6 times negative 6 is a positive 36. Then I multiply negative 6 times the negative square root of 6, and that's going to give me positive 6 and the square root of 6. Then we need to multiply the square root of 6 times negative 6, which would be negative 6 and the square root of 6, and then the square root of 6 times the negative square root of 6, which would give me negative 6. So remember, when you multiply the two square root of 6 and the square root of 6, it gives you a 6 only. The square root cancels. Okay, so then we simplify. The top part is going to stay the same, negative 30 minus 5 and the square root of 6. On the bottom, we have 36. These end up canceling each other out because they're the exact same thing, and one's positive and one's negative. And then here we have minus 6, so 36 minus 6. 36 minus 6 gives me 30. So I'm going to go ahead and divide it by 30. Okay, we can divide negative 30 by 30. That actually gives me a whole number, and it gives me negative 1. 5 divided by 30, we can't divide and get a whole number, we get a fraction. So 5 over 30 is the same thing as 1 over 6. And the square root of 6. And that's it. Okay. So this is the same thing, it's kind of repetitive. Probably, if you guys need more help tomorrow, I'll go ahead and go over 4, 5, and 6, but it's the exact same thing again. Okay. This next one, rationalize monomials. So this one is a little bit different. We're still having the same idea. We do need to cancel out the square root on the bottom. So on the bottom, we're going to multiply by the conjugate. So instead of minus the square root of 7, it's going to be plus the square root of 7. And that's what's going to cancel out the square root on the denominator. Okay. We don't have to get rid of the square root on the top. That's fine, as long as there's not one on the denominator. Okay. So what makes this problem different is we're going to have to multiply like we did. We multiply the 8 times both of these first, and then we'll multiply the square root of 2 times both of these. Okay, so 8 times negative 2 is going to give me negative 16. And then 8 times the square root of 7 is going to be 8 and the square root of 7. Then we do the square root of 2 times negative 2. We usually write the number in the front and then the square root second. Okay, so negative 2 and the square root of 2. And then the square root of 2 times the square root of 7 is going to give us the square root of 14. So here, both of them are positive, so it'll be plus the square root of 14. Both of them are square roots, yes, but they're not the same numbers, so the square root doesn't cancel out like it does in the previous problem. So all you gotta do is just multiply the numbers. The next part here on the denominator, we have negative 2 times negative 2 and negative 2 times the square root of 7. So negative 2 times negative 2 is positive 4. Negative 2 times the square root of 7 is the negative 2 and the square root of 7. And then here we have the negative square root of 7 times negative 2. That is going to end up giving me a positive because 2 negatives make a positive. So the positive 2 and the square root of 7. And then the negative square root of 7 times the negative square root of 7 gives me just a 7. It's going to be minus 7. So these two end up canceling each other out. And then on the bottom we have 4 minus 7 gives me 3. So it'll be 16 plus 8 in the square root of 7 minus 2 in the square root of 2 plus the square root of 14 over, we said 4 minus 7 is negative 3. Okay, we can't divide 16, 8, negative 2, the square root of 14 by negative 3 and get a whole number. So it's just going to stay like that. There's nothing we can do about this one. Okay. We can't combine these either because they don't have the same square roots. One's a square root of 7, the other one's a square root of 2. The square root of 14, we can't simplify it because the only numbers that give you 14 are 1 and 14 and 2 and 7. So those do not work. Okay, so let's go ahead and try another one. So we need to get rid of the square root on the bottom. We actually have 2. So we're going to multiply the top and the bottom by the square root of 5 plus the square root of 7. So remember, we change whatever the sign is in between them, we change it up, and that's how it ends up canceling it out. Okay, so then what I multiply on the bottom, I also have to multiply on the top to keep it equal. And so I'm going to distribute. Square root of 5 times the square root of 5 gives me, remember, when you have the same square root, the square roots cancel, and you're just left with the number inside, 5. Then we do the square root of 5 times the square root of 7. They're different numbers, so it has to stay there. It's going to be the square root of 35. Okay, then we're going to multiply the square root of 2 times the square root of 5. They're different square roots, so it's going to be plus the square root of 10. And the square root of 2 times the square root of 7 is going to be plus the square root of 14. Okay, all of this is going to go over. The square root of 5 times the square root of 5 is going to give me just 5 again. The square root of 5 times the square root of 7 is going to give me the square root of 35. So it's going to actually be minus. No, it's plus. Plus the square root of 35. Then we multiply the square root of 7. It's negative. So the negative square root of 7 times the square root of 5 is the negative square root of 35. And the negative square root of 7 times the square root of 7 is going to give me a whole number. And a negative and a positive give me negative. So it'll be negative 7. Okay, so then when we simplify, these two end up canceling each other out, and 5 minus 7 gives me negative 2. So that's what goes on bottom. On the top, it doesn't look like anything simplifies or cancels out because we have plus the square root of 35, plus the square root of 10. All these square roots can't simplify. Okay, because this would be 2 times 7. We can't take the square root of either one. This would be 2 times 5. We can't take the square root of 2 or 5. This would be 7 times 5. So none of that works. Go ahead and erase this. There's nothing we can do on the top. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, one more like this. So on the denominator, we have the square root of 3 times the square root, or minus the square root of 8. So we're going to cancel out the square roots by multiplying by the square root of 3 plus the square root of 8. What we do on the bottom, we also have to do on the top because we want to cancel out the square root on the bottom only. So we start multiplying. 2 times the square root of 3 is the square root of 6. The square root of 2 times the square root of 8 is going to be the square root of 16. Okay. Then we're going to multiply the square root of 12 times the square root of 3. That's going to give me the square root of 36. And last, the square root of 12 times, I went too far. The square root of 12 times the square root of 8 is going to give me the square root of 12 times 8 is 72. Right? I think so. Okay. On the denominator, we're going to multiply the square root of 3 times the square root of 3. It's the same square root, so it's going to give me 9. The square root of 3 times the square root of 8, that's going to give me a positive square root of 24. Then I multiply the square root, or the negative square root of 8 times the square root of 3. That's going to give me the negative square root of 24. And negative square root of 8 times the positive square root of 8. Well, negative and a positive give me a negative. And the square root of 8 times the square root of 8, since it's the same number, the square root cancels and it's just 8. Okay. So down here, when I combine like terms, these cancel out, and all I'm left with is 9 minus 8. So that gives me 1. On the top, we have the square root of 6. That does not simplify. The square root of 16, we can take the square root of 16. That gives us 4. We can also take the square root of 36. That gives us 6. And then 72, I believe we can simplify. 72 is the same thing as, what numbers? 16, I believe 16 goes in it. Let me try it. 72 divided by 16? No. 72 divided by 4, 9. 72 divided by 36. There you go. That gives us 2. So 36 times 2 gives us the square root of 72. Now we can take the square root of 36. Let me go ahead and let me put it in here. 36 times 2. We can take the square root of 36 and get a whole number, but we can't take the square root of 2 and get a whole number. So I'm going to go ahead and simplify this whole thing. We know 4 plus 6 gives us 10, plus the square root of 6. And then we can take the square root of 36, which is 6, and the square root of 2. All of this is divided by 1.